Greetings, everyone. Welcome to RIUNIT's latest podcast. Good morning if you're in Europe, good afternoon, Asia, good evening, Australia. Thank you for joining us once again. I have the amazing privilege today to welcome two very distinguished guests. Professor Howard, a Sri Lankan economist and a social scientist, retired associate professor in economics at the International Institute of Social Studies at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He has a wide range of experience and exposure and a very renowned and successful lecturer and teacher, including in financial economics. And we have the pleasure to welcome back Jayati Josh, who's a development economist, is currently professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's a professor of economics at chairperson at the Center of Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is a member of UN's High-Level Advisory Board for Economics and Social Affairs. I could go on, but we've been asked to keep it brief. So amazing pleasure to have you guys back. This is somewhat different today as we have absolutely no pre-planned schedule. We're coming at you extremely live and extremely direct. So that's partly to do with our confidence in the guests that we have. So I'll jump straight in, asking perhaps the most difficult question is, do we have a hold on what might happen next in the global economy? Looking forward, at least in the short term. Who would like to have a go first?
Howard?
I'll try. Okay. It's something that I and my son Bram, we follow fairly regularly, and that is the global recession. Is it coming? Isn't it coming? Etc. So what we do is we don't look at, let's say, political developments. At the moment, if you ask a pundit, they will say, well, it depends if Donald Trump gets into power or not, then we'll have a collapse of the economy or not, But we don't actually look at that. We look at especially numbers like profits data. We look at data on employment. We look at data on basic metals. And those are all flashing red at the moment. And it's not we alone that have picked this up, but we follow a guy called John Others. He's a very well-known pundit. And he raised at least two of the three indicators. And I'll go through the couple just to give the basics. The one he raised very recently is unemployment. And so when unemployment in the US starts to rise after having bottomed and rise very quickly, then a recession has followed virtually every single time in the post-war period within 2 years. Okay, so that's the first thing that he mentions. He calls that the SAN index, but I can assure you Bram has been following that long before the SAN index was there. Okay, so that's the first one. Then the second one is this metals. Now, in the last 3 to 4 weeks, we have seen a sudden worsening of the growth rate of industrial metals. So the two big ones are aluminium and copper, but also in there, nickel and zinc. And they've fallen very sharply. And usually that's a precursor to weakening. So that was the second one. And then the third one for us, because we follow China as the lead in the global economy. So China accounts for most of the manufacturing in the global economy. And where China goes, everyone else follows, as it were. And we thought that China was recovering. And indeed it was, let's say, up until somewhere like early June. but suddenly there's another deterioration in Chinese manufacturing. And there are a number of indicators we could look at, but these are the three things that appear to be very important. Included in all of this is the weakness in Europe and in Japan. Okay, so industrial production has not properly recovered in either of those countries, and therefore any weakening of the big two is likely to tip the global economy into recession. And currently, we agree with those who are forecasting a recession in the first quarter of 2025. So that was the starting part of that, Roshan. And then the second part, which is the corollary of it, is the stock market. That we see the US stock market as seriously overbought. And the only other one that's seriously overbought is the Indian stock market. And there are a couple of indicators, but the one that is the clearest is something called the Schiller PE, price earnings. And without getting into technical detail, when that is very high in value, you have to get nervous. And now we're currently at the second highest level in the post-Second World War period. So this is also flashing red light. And the debate at the moment is this justified by profits growth because of AI and the whole technology revolution? Or is this really because of the US's huge infusion of money into technology-driven companies? Okay, so I mean that's been quite significant and quite massive. So that's the sort of lay of the land as we see it. And on that score, we're very nervous about the stock markets. So whenever people tell me India, 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 I say, let me look at some of the data underlying that. And what it is, and Jayati, I think you're best to comment on this, there's a huge concentration of power and wealth. And it's basically those stocks that are rising because all government policies are designed to boost their profits. And, it's not that they're without profits, but this can't continue, obviously. This is a very imbalanced process, and we can't see any increases in per capita income and things like that. But okay, that's the way we
Thank
see
you,
it.
Howard. Very interesting, the three things you mentioned: the Chinese economy, the manufacturing, and the metals, aluminium and copper in particular, right? And US unemployment connection. Jayati, any comments on that?
No, I think this is a very interesting take. And I think, yes, I'm not going to, I'm willing to go with your judgment about early 2025 or so on. The exact timing of these things, I never really understand. But I do believe that you're fundamentally right, that this is a very fragile economy. And it's been a fragile economy, not just in the post-COVID recovery, certainly that's true, but actually in terms of the recovery after the global financial crisis. That it's a global economy, and that's why the India situation is quite interesting, because if you like, India is an extreme version of that same problem. It's an extreme version of something that looks very shiny and bright on top, but is actually completely hollow and in fact rotten inside, okay? And that's similar, I would argue, with global capitalism. It's really capitalism that has been kept alive with a series of blood transfusions. And you mentioned that already, the massive monetary policy increases in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in all the major advanced economies right after the global financial crisis, followed by then the significant fiscal expansions for a relatively brief period, but nonetheless very, very significant during the COVID pandemic. These have really operated to increase incomes of globally the top elites. And it's in very few countries that this has even trickled down to the real wage. In the US, we've had wage increases, which are not necessarily real wage increases. In fact, despite the Biden administration's many promises and even attempts, real wages in the US have been lagging behind. They're not, money wage increases are not keeping pace with inflation. There are just very few months in the year when it actually has been exceeding inflation. And in Europe, we know the situation that median wages are stagnant or falling. In India, the country that is seen as the big success story, we are getting an extreme version of that same phenomenon. We are getting an economy in which all the incentives are catering to the top 10% of the population and maybe the top 1% of businesses, which is to say the very large corporate sector, and within that, some favored cronies. Now, that works for a while, especially if they can take increased market share from small and medium enterprises and so on. But it is very difficult to do this over time in a situation where that means that the mass market is not growing. So that's true globally. The mass market is not growing, and that's true within, other than in China. In China, the mass market is growing, but everywhere else it's not. And in India, you find that we have a stagnant domestic mass market. And that's really why, despite all the hype, despite all the incentives, tax incentives, other subsidies, interest, you name it, investment rates in India have been falling. They were at their peak in about 2012 at maybe 34-35%, and they are down to between 29 and 31%. At the moment, it's around 31%. So their investment rates are down despite all of those incentives. And they're down because businesses ultimately only invest when they have a market. They don't invest only because you're giving them all those breaks. They use those breaks to improve their balance sheets, to make them look better on paper, and to build up their stock market valuations. So India is a classic extreme case of, I think, what is happening to global capitalism. And there I agree with you that this is a crisis waiting to happen.
Okay, my question actually, before I ask, I have some additional data to support Jayati. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% bagged nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world combined in the past 2 years, up to 2023. The super rich outstripped and they have grabbed half of all new wealth in the past decade. This is an ongoing trend. And the billionaire fortunes are increasing by 2.7 billion a day. And 1.7 billion workers now live in countries where inflation is outpacing wages. One more is if you taxed 5% of the world's multimillionaires and billionaires, that would raise 1.7 trillion a year, enough to lift 2 billion people out of poverty. So as you said, if only the super conglomerates are enjoying any kind of economic benefit or growth, and they need the market in order for them to thrive and expand, and we've come into a circle where that doesn't seem to be happening, especially since COVID. And I would argue, even in the years in the run up to it. So where's the logic to that in a globalized economy?
If I could just begin on this one, this is part of what Marx called the anarchy of capitalism. In other words, competition forces individual capitals to operate in a way which is fundamentally not even in their own enlightened self-interest. If you think about it, capital needs a market, and therefore it should be encouraging growing wages and actually more equality. But each individual capitalist necessarily has to maximize its own benefit, their own benefit. And that can often happen through expanding market share or expanding the profit margins, which is what happened in the whole post-COVID and Ukraine war situation as well. That is ultimately self-defeating, but the short-term interests, because that's the other part, is that it has to be the short-term interests of individual capitals, militates against any strategy that would actually enable such a expansion of the mass market. So you find it's one of the interesting things about wealth. It is hugely concentrated across individuals, as you mentioned, and the Oxfam report certainly mentions that. But the World Inequality Lab has a very interesting report where it points out that it's also between public and private. Globally, private wealth has expanded at the expense of public wealth. And so governments are losing wealth. And that in turn also enables them or reduces their ability to provide basic public services and all of the other kinds of things that we need for our global common good. So there is this whole process, and that's self-reinforcing, because the richer some people and corporations get, the more they are able to influence government policies, laws, regulations, etc., to become even more powerful, to get even wealthier.
Yes. I think the Marx point, I saw a twinkle in Howard's eye when you did mention Marx. So I'll let Howard step in before I make a comment on that.
Actually, the one thing that struck me when I listened to you, Jayati, was this, that Brum has produced this chart recently, which I can't get out of my head, and that it shows the growth rate of per capita income of China, Vietnam, and India, and compares that to the growth rate of real wages. And it shows the growth rate of real wages in China and Vietnam has more or less kept pace with the growth rate of per capita income, real per capita income. But in India, the growth of real wages is 1/8 of the growth in per capita income. Now, I think this actually speaks to something very important, and that is China and Vietnam are actually capitalist countries, but they're led by enlightened leaders who actually want a vibrant and dynamic capitalism. That is why they encourage massive competition. I mean, you just look at any of their main industries, they're incredibly competitive. And one problem with that for an investor is it pushes profits very low. So if you invest in BYD, for example, which is now the largest car company in the world, you won't get anything like the returns you will get from other car companies in the other advanced countries. And that is because you're now seeing a drift towards monopolies in a lot of the advanced countries. And that's why they have high share prices as well, because actually they are scamming money by having their monopoly positions, which are fed by the huge budget deficits as well. But in China and Vietnam, they're going down that road. They're actually getting the companies to fight with each other tooth and nail, and fight by developing technology. That is why the technology change is unbelievably rapid. You know, when I tell people this, because I teach in China and have a lot of friends in China, and almost every month they're telling me about some new developments, you know, and developments we've never heard of, never seen in other countries. And that is this massive technology dynamism. And the same you're seeing in Vietnam, you know, so there's actually this different dynamic. And as I say, it's not that they like poor people. It's not that they want to raise the living standards of people, but this actually makes sense in a capitalist economy, because otherwise, where's your market? And they're trying to develop their own alternative markets.
Very good point.
I think you're absolutely right, Howard. And in a sense, you know, this brings to my mind, when you were speaking, I was thinking absolutely about this whole idea about varieties of capitalism. And if I had to think of it that way, you know, China and Vietnam are state-led capitalism, state-directed and state-led. And some of it is through precisely what you're describing in terms of unleashing competition, forcing innovative technologies, etc., etc. Whereas India is monopoly capital-led states. It's a quite different situation. There used to be an old saying way back when we were young that, you know, about petroleum, oil companies, that either the state owns the oil companies or the oil companies own the state. And in a way, we're in that world now. It's not just oil, it's a whole range of other things.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely.
actually, sorry, I was just going to say it's the same thing. When we grew up, England was hailed as a mixed economy, which delivered the benefits of capitalism, free market motivation, and freedom to innovate, but balanced that with mitigating monopolies,
Mhm.
conflicts of interest. What's happened to all that?
Well, that was what neoliberalism was all about, right? Dismantling the welfare state, dismantling state-led capitalism, and providing a free rein to the so-called innovative powers of large capital. Now, it turns out that those innovative powers get massively muted when you are able to exert market power.
Right.
So, the history of the last 3 decades really is the history of expansion of market power of the big guys.
Yes, I have something to share on the big guys. I've come across a very good and insightful article by Omar Chitnis, who basically shows that BlackRock and Vanguard pretty much own everything, including the water companies in the UK. And they've pretty much taken the UK water supply down the drain, literally, unintended, because
Yes.
they're more interested in deriving revenue and profits than a healthy business. So things like sewage management and infrastructure investment, reinvestment has been discarded in favor of quick profits. Um, we were just speaking with Howard recently. It seems to be a case of privatizing profit-making enterprises and nationalizing those that make losses, right? Would that be fair? And one more point, something I've noticed, having coming to Sri Lanka on and off for the last better part of 50 years, without giving my exact age away, I always make this observation that since we were driven around by our uncles in the 80s or earlier, the size of the infrastructure has not increased by nearly even 10% as compared to the size and the prevalence of private wealth, the amount of SUVs, the number of cars, luxury cars, etc. So that in itself shows you that the government as an entity hasn't thrived, hasn't been able to meet the demands for better infrastructure from the public, but the public themselves have, through their means, enterprise and wheeling and dealing and whatnot, have grown and become wealthier. But where does that lead us? It's not fun driving around in Sri Lanka purely because of the situation that has prevailed. And this is from the developing economy point of view, right? Um, is the West also going to feel that perhaps from a different perspective, as I said, because when they privatized water 30 years ago in the UK, they said this is the start of everybody owning a share of. I think they coined the phrase, O2 or own. I'll find that somewhere, but basically it hasn't happened. It's just gone into the hands of very few conglomerates. Is there a way back?
Um,
Howard?
Well, actually, I just wanted to mention a curious thing with Keir Starmer saying he's going to take over the railways again into the public sector.
Ah,
Now, there, people were clapping and cheering and so on. But actually, one of his biggest backers, who was traditionally the backer of the Conservative Party, was Richard Branson. And Richard Branson's Virgin Atlantic train service was a disaster, utter money losing machine. And each government that came in bankrolled him for the losses until such time now that he can't make it work, because you can't do this to a national rail system, fragment it and make it work without having to charge the earth. So now what he wants is for the state to bail him out. And this actually has happened many times in the past. You privatize, these guys, asset strip, basically, that's what they do. And the whole thing collapses, and you can't have a collapsed rail system and run a modern economy. So then the government comes back in and pays them top dollar, or in this case, top pound, to get the rail system back and working. And, maybe 10 years, 20 years down the road, we'll have again, let's privatize that, because it's working well and generating reasonable revenues and so on and so forth. This is absurd. This is absurd. And the most interesting thing, Richard Branson has always been a supporter of the Conservative Party, always. So for him to have backed Keir Starmer, there's only one reason he did, because he's going to get a windfall. His Virgin Galactic is also collapsing, and I wouldn't be surprised if the British government says, "Oh, we'll take over his space program as well and bankroll that." This is basically where we have allowed corporations to own our governments and to tell them this is how you're going to use the money. They already cancelled the supplement to pensions in Britain, no? Because they said somehow 20 billion has disappeared from the coffers. And they said that means that our promise to pensioners of a supplement has to now be discarded. This is predictable. In the end, these people are captives.
Yes. Is there a way, are we heading towards imitating the Western system of privatization, which has proven 3 decades down the line that it does not actually deliver?
I don't know if we're heading or we're already in that. Yeah.
Yes.
We're already in that situation where we're privatizing the better public sector utilities, enterprises, potentially profitable activities, and we're taking over the bad ones. Yes, we are very much doing that. And then we are enabling the asset stripping, because remember, that also is not something that is just left to chance. In other words, you could control that if you had appropriate regulations, if you had proper monitoring of what was going on. You could have controlled all of that. So it's not, the political economy is not one where, because you've handed it over to the private and they have behaved badly, there's nothing else you could have done. Even at that point of privatizing, if you remember when the myths we were all fed, we were told that there would be privatizing of these monopolies, which we had earlier seen as natural monopolies, but the impact of having it as a private monopoly would be contained by a proper regulation. And there would be an independent regulatory body that would look at pricing, that would look at investment in there, which would look at repair and, et cetera, all of those things. Of course, we realize that was basically hogwash to get everyone to agree to this idea. And we are seeing this over and over again. Yes, England for sure. Look at what happened to Greece. Look at what's happening in India with, all these accidents and bridges that were built by private contractors collapsing a week after they've been inaugurated, and so on and so forth. So this is across the world, you see this. But is there a way out of it? I would say yes, because otherwise we don't want everybody to just go home and get on their beds in depression. There is a way out, and there have been instances, I would argue, even relatively recently, of governments trying to claw back some of the basic rights of humans, of citizens. Certainly in Latin America, we saw in the 2000s, what was called the pink tide at that time, a reversal of the extreme neoliberal experiment that really came to flower in Chile first and then in a lot of other Latin American countries, assisted by military dictatorships. We saw clawing back in many cases. We have seen in a bunch of other countries the recognition that you have to now definitely exercise greater control over natural resources, not allow private multinational mining companies to take all the benefits, that there is a very strong case for keeping utilities in public hands, but I want to emphasize in accountable public hands. Because, those of us who support state intervention, we have to keep emphasizing that we want accountable state intervention. not a state intervention that becomes a law unto itself and is therefore hand in glove with the cronies and not answerable to ordinary people. But yes, it can be done, and it is being done in a number of cases. So I think there is hope, and I think people and social movements that are arguing for a reversal of these or a prevention of the privatizations that are being proposed as part of adjustment packages, I think they're on a relatively strong wicket, because the intellectual case for this has collapsed. The popular case for this has collapsed. I don't think people believe it anymore. I mean, the popular upswing, upsurges in so many countries are not about giving more power to the private sector. They're really about ensuring that everybody has access to their basic needs and to their social and economic rights, and to some degree of economic security, all of which require a really a comeback of a state that is oriented towards people.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, that gives us hope. Listening to you, sure people will feel much better. But I think before we get carried away, we have to also recognize the totally pervasive nature of where we are in the Western world and in the development, in terms of how the super conglomerates have pretty much looped their business model that incorporates um, tax havens, ownership of the media, building bridges between the businesses and the politics, using charities as a way to avoid and conceal conflicts of interest, right? I think we're just touching on the surface of it. So it might take time, but it's a journey worth embarking on. Would it be triggered by, to a certain extent, by some kind of a political shift through awareness of the public? Um,
I think it can only be political shifts. It
yeah,
can't happen because governments suddenly see the light and decide to be good. It will only happen when popular movements force governments to change.
absolutely. Yes. Um, any comments on the,
I just had one comment on your BlackRock point,
please?
Roshan,
Yes.
because there's a feeling that BlackRock is trying to capture global assets. But last week or week before, Larry Flink, the head of BlackRock, he turned around and said, we are starting a new initiative. It's a global initiative to provide capital for infrastructure. In other words, they don't want development banks in developing countries. We don't need that. Here is private capital, and we're going to do that through the ISBs. So, instead of ISBs just being offered to developing countries, we're actually going to link it to infrastructure with a guarantee of assets behind that. So that I thought was really interesting, because BlackRock is a rentier entity. They make money as rentiers. They're not going to buy and make assets work. They're not going to actually run railways and actually manage water systems and so on and so forth. They're going to do what any good rentier does, and that is basically get interest or rental income in some way or another. And I found that actually went under the radar in lots of cases. I haven't read commentaries on that, because that was a really major announcement by Larry Flink. And I thought that here we go. This seems to be the new vehicle, because there are so many countries that are talking of, including Sri Lanka, development banks. And now this is their alternative to it. Don't worry about development banks. We will kill two birds with one stone. We'll also give you the foreign exchange. But instead of having bilateral money to help you with this, or FDI, we will just lend it to you.
Which brings us nicely onto, unless Jayati wanted to say something, I was going to turn to the Sri Lankan case study, which we were going to get into, because I know how it has been following the so-called Great Deal that the government has made with the ISPs. Would you
But
like
I just want
to?
to, yeah, I'd like
Yes.
to add just one thing about this. I completely agree with you, Howard. But this is basically BlackRock taking advantage of the whole idea of blended finance, which is now becoming so popular in international circles. And so the whole idea is that, oh, yes, we have to move from billions to trillions to actually do anything for greening the economy, to cope with our sustainable development goals, to do, etc. Right? Whole idea is that there's not enough money with the public sector. It has to be done from the private sector. So the private sector has to be incentivized. And of course, we all know what that means. It means de-risking, something that the economist Daniela Gabor has written a lot about. You were mentioning some of her work earlier. It means the public sector underwriting all the risks and costs of the private investment. And the multilateral development banks also actually providing that, leveraging their inputs in the market for private sector to get into. So BlackRock is basically positioning itself saying, we're here. You want to do the big billions to trillions? Look at us. We've got all these 23 trillion in assets. Give us all of these incentives and subsidies. We'll do it.
In fact, Jayati, Bloomberg has referred to BlackRock as the fourth branch of government because they're the only private firm agency that works closely with the central banks.
Right.
Something incredible if you take on board things like conflicts of interest and monopoly.
Well, with the reference to Sri Lanka, I mean, BlackRock actually owns half of developing country debt today, the sovereign debt.
Right.
And of course, in Sri Lanka too, they have a very major role.
Yes. So Howard, what do you make of the deal that Sri Lanka has into? Are we trapping ourselves into a guaranteed future debt crisis?
Actually, I'd like to hear Jayati's elaboration of what she said in that discussion, and I'll chip in.
Yes.
To me, it's almost like what's been happening in Sri Lanka over the last few years is like a Greek tragedy compressed. It is so tragic that you've had this wonderful social movement that people were doing, in a spontaneous way that was peaceful, that was revolutionary in terms of actually throwing out a bunch of people. And then you get effectively, if not the same individuals, you get the same thing back. You get the same elites in power doing worse now, doing much, much worse, with the active assistance of the international community in the form of the IMF, and with being punished in ways that are extraordinary because they did not really gain from that earlier period of, when debt was accumulated. So I think everything that has happened since then, the deal with the IMF, which I think was extremely infructuous and very unequal, and also massively over-optimistic in terms of the debt sustainability analysis, which meant that the haircut that creditors had to take was significantly less than it should have been, imposing extremely unfortunate conditions on Sri Lankan people in all kinds of ways, in terms of cutting the essential spending for public services and so on. Extremely unfair in an openly class way in terms of forcing domestic debt restructuring that is most of all being imposed on the pension funds, which is the hard-earned savings of poor people, of workers on plantations, garment workers, women often disproportionately. So it's been an extremely unfair and unequal process. Of course, each time when the IMF deal was presented and signed, it was presented both within Sri Lanka and by the global financial press as this huge victory for Sri Lanka, that it's shown that it can actually get the confidence of the IMF and so on. Now, this deal with the international sovereign bondholders, I believe it's appalling. I believe it will actually land Sri Lanka in a worse debt trap. And I think it's also deeply unfair in many ways that Howard knows better than me. And yet it's being presented again as this big victory for the Sri Lankan government, that it has come to a deal with the bondholders. And this is true whether you're looking at the Financial Times and the London Economist, or you're looking at a lot of the Sri Lankan press. which to me is bizarre, because this is actually not in the interests of a government that cares for its own people, or even a government that cares for its own financial viability over the medium term. And yet, this government is claiming that it's a good deal. It's extraordinary.
An example of a failure which is being talked about just before Howard steps in is until a couple of months ago, if you wanted to visit Sri Lanka, you'd go through your visa process, which was handled by Mobitel, a state-owned telecom service provider. But now that $28 or whatever goes through to a offshore account in Dubai, connected to a private company. There was absolutely no need to privatize something which was bringing in, seamless revenue. Whereas now, actually, the Indian embassy had to make a statement from Colombo saying that it's not an Indian company, because initially people said that something which was making very easy money was sold off when Sri Lankan Airlines, the Ceylon Electricity Board, the Ports Authority, etc. The Ports Authority may be an exception, but so many SOEs are making losses. Why would you do that? So that still is the case. We don't know why. Apparently, it was an unsolicited proposal, which was accepted without due process to procurement. And now, one of our social commentators here, former chairman of the T-Board, put out a video showing that actually, when you try to get a visa to Sri Lanka now, it's actually quite a painful process it takes you through. And that's simply because a company based in Dubai who may represent a competitor holiday-making country, for example, may want you to get, pissed off with getting a visa if you're a Frenchman or a Spaniard or whatever, and then say, okay, forget this, I'll go to, Morocco instead.
Wow.
So the Greek tragedy part that you mentioned could get worse, unfortunately. I hope the attention that it's been having has some impact, and they revoke it or relook at it, at least. Sorry. So back to you, Howard, about the overall situation there.
The point about the macro-linked bonds or the government-linked bonds, I know we had this article where the people writing the article said that the Chinese Development Bank, in effect, is treated unfairly compared to the ISB holders. But actually, for me, there's a more fundamental issue here. And the fundamental issue is, or at least, and that's what I wanted to ask you, Jayati, is I do not know of any other country that has governance-linked bonds, where basically, so let's forget even about the reduction in the haircut if GDP grows over this amount, although I want to come back to that, and the increase in interest rates if GDP grows by this amount in the next 3 years. Okay, but forget that. But there is this other element in it, which Verite is responsible for, or allegedly, where they have been congratulated by BlackRock, Bloomberg's, and the IMF. And that is this governance-linked element. And that means that any government coming into power, if they want to get this haircut, does not simply have to raise the growth rate, but they also have to do it by increasing taxation as a percentage of GDP. In other words, I'm now telling any future government what their economic strategy has to be. It has to be deflationary, in other words. I think you made that point several times, Jayati, that this is really about a deflationary strategy. But now they've built it in to these governance-linked bonds. Now, one of the things for me is not negotiating about the interest rates and the haircuts and so on and so forth, but the starting point is take this element out. apparently Zambia was asked to do this and they refused it. So I think I can't understand how this has been allowed in, because you know why BlackRock is so happy? Because supposing the Sri Lankan government doesn't make the average of 3.1% growth rate, then BlackRock can still say, but you haven't met the governance targets, therefore we have a much lower haircut. You know what I mean? They win both ways. And they must have thought it's Christmas, when they saw this. And the head of Verite, Nishan, he was invited to give a presentation at SOAS. God knows who paid for it. Okay, and why SOAS would invite someone like Nishan to actually say this as a new mechanism for screwing developing countries, because if this is accepted as a precedent, you know what's going to happen next with all the other countries. And I think this has not been emphasized enough in the discussions, So it's the first thing I would say to a new government: get this clause out.
Mm,
And
absolutely.
this is non-negotiable, because you are now interfering with our policies. Any future government being constrained in this way, it's a disaster.
I completely agree with you, Howard, but I think that's the reason they're rushing to do this now, before there's a new government.
Of course.
I think everyone can see the writing on the wall that this government is not going to last. And so they want to tie the hands of any future government. And this is something, therefore, I believe that is very much, I don't want to be conspiracy theory about it, but I think it's the Sri Lankan elites who are, let's face it, hand in glove with global capital on this one.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
who are really trying to come to an arrangement whereby whoever comes to power cannot change the economic strategy away from a very deeply neoliberal and unequal strategy. So yes,
Absolutely.
I think it's disastrous for sure, but I think the entire thing is disastrous. I think certainly the governance linked part is obscene and would never be allowed, let us say, for example, in the United States.
Yeah.
They would never not dream of enabling any such kind of control, right?
Yeah.
But even the macro-linked bonds are so unequal and problematic. It's not just that China and the Chinese Development Bank and others get a worse deal than other creditors, but it's also that the very way it's designed, it is very likely for Sri Lanka to actually exceed that declared nominal dollar target without an improvement in the real GDP, and without even definitely not an improvement in real wages or employment levels or anything like that. So my colleague C.P. Chandrasekhar has actually done, I'm going to just give you some of those numbers because I think they're important. He's done a basic estimate, okay? The whole idea is that there is this base amount, and if the average Sri Lankan nominal gross domestic product in dollar terms exceeds what is expected over 2025 to 2027, that average, then in fact they get they can reduce the haircut. They have to be paid more, okay, the bondholders, and plus, okay, they have to be. There is another addition that they have to cover past due interest with an interest of 4%, and they have to be paid a consent fee upfront of 1.8%. Now, here's the thing. If the nominal GDP exceeds the IMF's baseline, which is at the moment it's $88.6 billion over this average, to the extent where it crosses any of the thresholds, that it's more than this, then actually the haircut falls steeply. If it crosses $92, the haircut $92 billion, the haircut goes from 28% to 20%. At $96 to 85%, and so on and so forth. Now you will say, well, look, the Sri Lankan economy is in terrible shape, it's not going to grow. But remember, Sri Lanka had a massive depreciation, massive depreciation, and it is only likely and inevitable that the Sri Lankan rupee will appreciate at least slightly relative to the US dollar. But the other is that you're looking at nominal GDP. You're not looking at real GDP. So, in fact, nominal GDP can increase because of inflation. And remember, in the last 5 months, nominal GDP has been close to 4%. It's 3.68%. So, in fact, this nominal GDP metric and the fact that you're looking at the nominal GDP in US dollar terms, you're not looking at your ability to raise dollar revenues. You're not looking at export and tourism revenues, which would at least have some element of sense to it. You're just looking at the overall GDP in nominal terms calculated at the US dollar rate. So there are two things that are stacked against Sri Lanka. First is that the nominal GDP can grow without the real GDP growing very much, and certainly without real wages growing very much, or the wage share of the economy growing at all. But the second is that if the rupee appreciates even slightly relative to the dollar, even by 10-15%, you're likely to cross that threshold. And once you cross that threshold, I mean, it's not Christmas, it's heaven, it's paradise, it's raining Christmases for the bondholders. There is no way that they will not get a smaller haircut.
Yeah, it's a nightmare for Sri Lankans. Sweeney Todd haircut, the demon hairdresser from Fleet Street. Whereas,
Sweeney Todd.
That's the one, yeah. Because it's linked to growth and governance, so they could
And it's not real growth. It's not linked to real growth. It's linked to nominal growth in dollar terms, which is such a con.
Exactly. Actually, you're right.
Only Sri Lankan people realize this is an enormous con.
We've seen artificial rebounding of the economy, 5.3% in Q1 this year, which feels very artificial, if you look at the business environment here, or if you speak to the head of the SME Federation, who, they account for more than 50% of employment and almost half the contribution to GDP. But she will tell you a different story, the experience that SMEs have had to go through.
And after all of this, at the end of the period, Sri Lanka will still have a higher level of debt to GDP.
Yeah.
So even according to their own calculations, so why would you do this? It beggars belief that any government would agree to this, unless they were not really operating in the interests of their own people.
Is Ladbrokes taking bets on Sri Lanka's next default date, Howard?
Actually, I was thinking this when listening to Jayati, because I'm pretty sure the IMF is not that stupid that they don't realize this is a disaster in the making. Now, we've done just a cursory study showing that all developing countries that have such a severe contraction of GDP always rebound to a certain extent. If you take the contraction as 15%, then what they're talking about, if Sri Lanka rebounds by 9%, then essentially there's no haircut. You know what I mean? So we're still below the GDP that we started with. And they're going to benefit because they won't take the haircut. You know what I mean? So the IMF studies show that all countries rebound by a certain amount. Yes. And therefore, to say that they're not complicit in this, I don't believe it for 1 minute. I believe they're complicit in it. They've actually had this particular 3-year period with this 3.1 deliberately as a result of their own studies showing that nearly all countries minimally get back to at least 70 to 80% of their previous GDP. Absolutely. And we're taken for a ride. I mean, no one has done these studies. No one discusses it. In fact, I would hazard a guess, this is probably the first time it's ever been discussed in public. What we're now saying is something that has not actually been said. Because what happens is everyone is so engrossed with, well, should it be 8.5% or 8.75%, or, is this the haircut or that the haircut? They don't understand. They're not looking at the principles. As I said before, one principle is this governance criteria. And the second principle, and remember, the adjudicator of the governance criteria is the IMF. So you couldn't get a worse scenario than that. And then the second is what Jayati just mentioned, is this rebound. I mean, all we're talking about is a rebound unless the economy is a complete basket case. And that's very, very rare, even in the countries that have been really badly hit by a disaster. They always rebound. They always rebound. It's the question is what happens after that rebound. Is it sustainable? But they don't care.
And
Of
also,
course they
the
don't
rebound
care.
is not full, as you said. You'll still be below the level before the crisis.
Exactly. And
Again, artificial.
then we're being punished with that as well. So it's a guarantee that that rebound will never be sustainable. We will be back into the debt trap. And that, Jayati, for me, I actually blame the Sri Lankan business community, because we have a tradition in Sri Lanka that whichever government comes in, the business community sycophants them. So you will see how the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce congratulated the government on what it did, and everyone was gushing over the government and saying, oh, how wonderful, and so on. And I ask people, why is it wonderful? What have we gotten from it? Yeah, now foreigners will look at us with favorable eyes. Bullshit. They will only look at us with favorable eyes if they see a real profits machine being generated in Sri Lanka, a really aggressive development strategy, which is yielding all the benefits that such a strategy should yield. We are starting with our hands tied behind our back. I mean, this is insane. And I tell people who ask me, should I now invest in Sri Lanka? I said, if you want to lose money, go ahead. But if you don't want to lose money, there are plenty of other alternatives. But this is what has happened in Sri Lanka.
One exception may be property, which seems to have recovered to the pre-COVID levels in dollar terms.
Which is the worst thing to even say, Roshan, that it is
There
only
you go.
property.
It's all the non-tradables.
But it's true.
Property,
Yeah.
stock market, etc. Yes.
No, it's terrible.
It seems the design and the complicity on the IMF doesn't shock me, but the complicity on the side of local think tanks that rubber stamp and endorse these things always surprise me, but it shouldn't, I guess. We're living in this environment. It shouldn't shock us.
I wanted to ask Jayati a question about have you looked at the Public Finance Management Bill, Jayati? The Sri Lankan
I have
Public
not. But there was another bill that something about the land, the control over land, which was also deeply terrifying, which was put in.
That I saw the Economic Transformation Bill. These are the two bills.
That's the one, the Economic Transformation Bill.
Right.
I imagine that both are along very, very similar lines. And it is deeply terrifying. Both of them would tie the hands of any future government. They would actually prevent any mass demand-based, sustainable kind of increase of the Sri Lankan economy in the medium term very, very significantly. Right. So I don't know how much discussion there has been within Sri Lanka of these.
Actually, very little. There have been a couple of newspaper articles, and people keep nudging me to write something because I
think it's crucial. I think it's crucial because these are horrifying bills. Actually,
I just wanted to make this point just in case you haven't fully gotten into this, Jayati, and now you tell me you haven't. In this bill, the starting premise is we have a public debt of over 100% of GDP. This is problematic. Okay, I can accept that. But it doesn't actually break down domestic and foreign debt.
Exactly.
That's the first starting point. And then underlying assumption is the problem of the debt, in other words, also foreign debt, is the budget deficit. And it's not the budget deficit that's the problem, it's the primary deficit. In other words, the interest burden which
Yes.
is the highest in the world.
Mm.
And we have shown data to show that Sri Lanka's interest burden is the highest in the world, is completely excluded from this bill.
Mm.
The entire focus is on the primary deficit, and solving that is automatically going to solve our foreign debt problem. Nothing about how we're going to earn the foreign exchange, and nothing about how we're going to reduce the domestic interest component of this debt. And the reason is this, Jayati, because you may have followed that we have a central bank act that prevents the central bank from buying government debt. In other words, all government debt is going to be commercial from now on. And the banks are going to sit there and have this phenomenon of shooting fish in a barrel. Because the government has to finance. The banks just collude. We know they collude at auctions. We know that. And we're never going to have low interest rates ever again, because this is always the benchmark for all interest rates. It's the interest rates on government debt. But I noticed that this...
Don't worry, Howard. Elon Musk is here next week.
You cynic.
Jayati, how are we for time? Are you good for...
Well, yeah. Oh dear, yes. Let me actually respond to this. I think this is a very, very important point that Howard has made. And first of all, I do believe that this really talks about the complicity of the Sri Lankan elite in this entire process. Because, they need not have agreed to the clubbing of the domestic debt with the foreign debt, even in the restructuring process. They tried to do this in Zambia and Ghana. They did not succeed.
Exactly.
The IMF actually suggested this in both these countries. They did not succeed. This is entirely on the Sri Lankan elite. That they actually agreed to this. Having agreed to it, then imposing the burden of that domestic debt restructuring on the pension funds rather than the banks. Which, arguing that this will lead to a financial crisis, which of course it will, which is why nobody agrees to these things. But also this whole idea that that when you are dealing with an external debt problem, you don't have to worry about where you're getting the resources to service the external debt. That is something which is unthinkable. I have to tell you that when I described this, I was at a conference, in fact, on sovereign debt held by the Vatican, where the Pope is extremely interested in calling for a debt jubilee next year, in fact. But when I mentioned this particular fact, many people who deal with debt issues in the room said, "Are you sure? Is this really, can they be doing this? Does it mean, no, you must be wrong." They did not believe that this could happen. So I think there is, you mentioned, it's not just Sri Lankan business, the complicity, but the elites, they have a very strong adverse role to play in this, I think, which is definitely not in the interests of the economy in any medium or long term. But also the fact that once you club these together, then your entire focus is on the primary surplus or deficit. And you stop thinking at all about how you can reduce the interest component of that. And there are, of course, two ways to reduce that interest. You can reduce the sum total principal that you have to pay on, and through the haircuts that we've been talking about, and you can reduce the rate of interest. And the government, from the moment of the crisis, perceived controlling the rate of interest as a way to deal with the crisis, to attract capital again, to prevent inflationary tendencies, etc., etc. When in fact the inflationary tendencies were cost-driven. They were driven by the devaluation, they were driven by the dramatic increase in oil and food prices globally, which got even worse because the currency had devalued. And instead of addressing that or recognizing that, they said, "Oh, we have to raise interest rates." So there is a very deep complicity here. I won't call it just the financial sector. I think it's the elites broadly. But these are elites not operating in the interests of the country. I think that is definitely evident.
Absolutely.
I think our problem, Jayati, is that we have shifted to a rentier economy. For the rentiers, this is a great place to live, Sri Lanka. And you can see that. So many of my friends are exactly in that category. They're rentiers, and especially during the crisis, it was like a gold mine, to come here, because they were getting 32% on risk-free bonds, and now currently, while the inflation rate is under 5%, the interest rate, the core interest rate, is 9%. So you have a real interest rate, which is 4%, as if Sri Lanka is some massive industrial powerhouse, that can afford a real interest rate of 4%. And the governor of the
There is no industrial powerhouse in the world that has that real interest rate.
Of course. And
there can't be one that way.
Our governor of the central bank actually use this as one of the examples of how well he's running the central bank. He said, look at our real interest rates, they're so high, etc., etc. On this score, this is what I wanted to say. If you look at the central bank report of 2023, there's something very weird has happened. Somebody in the central bank has written the cause of inflation in Sri Lanka in 2022-23, and they said it's entirely cost-driven. Yet the IMF and the governor went on record saying it's due to the printing of money by the previous government. But it's there, it's in a box, and somebody that I was actually working with, he's a very senior person in the stockbroking sector, he picked this up and he wrote an article and published in the newspaper. And he said, so the government admits that it was cost-driven, yet they raised interest rates to these extraordinary levels, you see. And the only reason they were doing that is to benefit the rentier class. That's all. Because there can't be any economic rationale for it. And heaven knows why they allowed it to be published in the central bank review, because it's an extremely good dissection. I mean, in great detail, exactly what the costs were and how it transmitted into the economy and so on. So I urge you to even look at that, Jayati, because it's great ammunition for...
Yeah, sure. That's excellent. Thank you for letting me know. But I mean, I have to leave, but I'm sure you can carry on this discussion wonderfully because there's so much more to talk about. I just want to say that I still have hope. I don't see this as this endless abyss, because to me, the Aragala was incredibly inspiring in terms of what a popular movement can do peacefully. And I think if you've done it once, you can do it again.
Absolutely. And, we could talk about Bangladesh perhaps another time. And I just spoke to our team in Dhaka. They said it's 100% to do with internal discontent, and not as we might suspect.
Kenya, exactly similar.
Thanks so much, Jayati. It was very inspirational what you said about social movements, and absolutely a countering force to corrupt elites and galloping inequality.
It's a great pleasure always to talk to you and particularly to Howard. So thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
Wishing you all the best.
Pleasure was mine, Jayati. Thank you.
Thank you so much.